Chamberlain just exploded. This memorandum is an ultimatum, not a negotiation. It has the word memorandum at the top, retorted Hitler. I am more impressed by the contents than the title, said Chamberlain. And he added that it would have a very bad effect on British public opinion. People would say that Hitler was behaving like a conqueror. No, Hitler cut in, like the owner of his property.
Hello, and welcome to Creating History, and a series of podcasts exploring pivotal summit meetings where leaders, strategy and history collide on the world stage. I'm Russell Barnes, filmmaker and producer.
And I'm David Reynolds, an author and history professor at Cambridge University.
This is the second episode examining the negotiations that led to the Munich Agreement at the end of September 1938. It's the month that marked the birth of modern summitry, pioneered by Neville Chamberlain. His aim was to avert a European war over Czechoslovakia, which Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime seemed poised to invade.
Munich has since become a symbol of surrender to the threat of force. But that meeting was the third encounter in just a couple of weeks between the two leaders. And the detailed story is more nuanced, complex, and zigzaggingly dramatic than the standard narrative usually told today.
So, David, the first meeting between Hitler and Chamberlain was at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Afterwards, Chamberlain took back to London a plan that the Führer proposed to try to resolve the crisis peacefully. We left the story in the last episode just as Chamberlain began his second meeting with Hitler at Bad Godesberg on the Rhine on 22nd of September. As before, this was conducted through interpreters, which often made the exchanges frustratingly slow and ponderous. The Prime Minister began by explaining how he had brought London, Paris and Prague behind Hitler's proposal of transferring German-speaking areas of Czechoslovakia in the Sudetenland to the Reich under the aegis of an international commission. So how did Hitler respond as Chamberlain laid this out?
Well, Hitler began with some soft soap, if you like. He thanked Chamberlain for his great efforts to achieve a peaceful solution. But then his face darkened. I'm terribly sorry, but it's no longer of any use. And he launches into a long diatribe about the untenable situation at the frontier, a succession of violent clashes, constant stream of refugees. The whole problem, he declares, must be solved finally and completely by October the 1st at the very latest.
So what seemed like a done deal was unravelling.
Yeah.
And he was making outrageous demands to bring on the war that he really always wanted.
Yes, once again, Hitler had wrong-footed Chamberlain. The Prime Minister was angry, his face reddened. But by the time the interpreter had finished, Chamberlain collected himself and he stated emphatically that he had secured everything that Hitler had asked for without, he said, the expenditure of a drop of German blood. And then he went on with rising indignation, I have been obliged to take my political life in my hands. And at this, Hitler did backtrack a little bit. And he said that, well, the only way to resolve the situation peacefully was now for them to simply agree a frontier immediately, without any reference to international commissions. So once again, a proposal that has been apparently consensual. Hitler stripped back an essential part of it, the international agreement, the international commission, and said, let's do it now as quickly as possible over this table. So Chamberlain tries to pin down some specifics, but the conversation becomes increasingly scrappy because Hitler, in the usual style, keeps exploding about this and that, Czech atrocities and things like that. So after a while, they're getting very tired and hungry. They agree to pick all this up in the morning. And Chamberlain sends a terse cable to Lord Halifax, his foreign secretary back in London. First meeting unsatisfactory.
So once again, Hitler has pulled the rug from under Chamberlain's feet. He gained the concessions he demanded from the first meeting, but was now upping his demands to extract more concessions. Hitler really was proving to be a more skillful practitioner of summitry. What was Chamberlain's mood after the meeting?
Grim and very angry. He'd come back to London from Berchtesgaden, convinced Hitler was not mad. He'd acted on that assumption. Yet now Hitler's behaving in a way that again defies rationality. He's making demands that are clearly going to be unacceptable to Chamberlain's cabinet colleagues, not to mention the government and people of Czechoslovakia. They're being, frankly, treated as pawns in this great power diplomacy. The summitry that Chamberlain's initiated is now clearly spinning out of his control. And he's increasingly isolated at home. His inner circle is now bombarding him with requests for information, while they're also making contingency plans for a possible war with Germany. And remember, it's a war that, if it breaks out, it's assumed it will begin with catastrophic bombing raids on London. So Chamberlain feels he's got no choice but, in the current mood now, to cancel the planned meeting next morning. He sends over a letter spelling out exactly why Hitler's new proposals could not be met, and while he waits for an answer, Chamberlain paces the terrace of his hotel on the other bank from Hitler's hotel, and he tells his closest advisor, Horace Wilson, that he fears for his premiership if the talks collapse. Now, Chamberlain's usually very buttoned up, keeps his emotions to himself. And this is the first time, I think, that he'd made such a confession. He's seeing just how high the stakes have risen.
And so messages were then sent to and fro across the river as Chamberlain tried to pin Hitler down to a clearer statement of his demands. Eventually, he was promised a memorandum with maps. So in the evening, the British crossed the river once more.
Yes, they were now expecting this memorandum with maps, but as soon as they met, the two leaders met again, it was clear that the German memo required the Czechoslovaks to evacuate the Sudetenland within days, by September the 28th. And Chamberlain just exploded. This memorandum is an ultimatum, not a negotiation. It has the word memorandum at the top, retorted Hitler. I am more impressed by the contents than the title, said Chamberlain. And he added that it would have a very bad effect on British public opinion. People would say that Hitler was behaving like a conqueror. No, Hitler cut in, like the owner of his property.
Wasn't Hitler willing to make any minor concessions?
Yes, but they were minor. They were mainly about wording. So, for example, the word demands was replaced with proposals. And after Chamberlain denounced the document's what he called peremptory and rigid timetable, Hitler again backed off a fraction. He agreed to a later completion date of October the 1st. Which is, not very different from September the 28th.
Yeah.
Chamberlain also managed to chip away a bit at the area to be occupied by German troops, but then he said he would submit the proposals to Prague. And near the end, Hitler stared hard at Chamberlain. He said, "You are the first man to whom I have ever made a concession." Did he mean it? Did he not? Or was it all part of the act?
As they parted, though, the leaders did have a bit of a friendlier exchange, and Chamberlain clearly hoped Summitry still had a future.
Well, he certainly tried to sound that note. He spoke of the relationship of confidence that had grown up between the two of them in the last few days, which he said allowed each of them to speak very frankly without the other taking offence. Hitler agreed, and Chamberlain said goodbye with a sort of boisterous Auf Wiedersehen as he departed. But I think he's really trying to make the best of a mess into which he's got himself. Hitler has once again ratcheted up his demands, and once again Chamberlain has been taken aback. But this time he did play a harder game. He did at least force the Führer to put his demands on paper, to modify them, but you have to say what is now being asked of the Czechs was absolutely appalling. But Chamberlain, I think, was not thinking at all about them. For him now, having gambled his political future on Summitry, he had climbed too far to turn back.
And so once again, Chamberlain heads back to London and he has to deliver a tricky report to his cabinet.
Yes, once again, there's a positive spin he puts on the visit. He admits his anger at the first day when Hitler upped his demands, but he says that after further conversation, the Führer had made concessions. The cabinet minutes, in their very formal, detached way, are really quite dramatic here, capturing what Chamberlain said. Herr Hitler had a narrow mind and was violently prejudiced on certain subjects, but he would not deliberately deceive a man whom he respected and with whom he had been in negotiation. And Chamberlain added, when Hitler announced that he meant to do something, it was certain that he would do it. Indeed, he commented that he came away feeling that the Führer had now a certain respect for him, the Prime Minister.
Quite strange, really, given the runaround he'd been given by Hitler twice in 10 days.
Yes, Chamberlain even told the cabinet he was sure the Führer was telling the truth when he said that after the Sudetenland he had no more territorial ambitions in Europe. Either he's being incredibly naive or, well, I think more likely he's just in so deep that he has no choice but to persuade himself that Hitler's telling the truth. So he tells his cabinet colleagues he can see no hope for a peaceful solution except on the basis of Hitler's memorandum as modified in those late-night talks. The cabinet, he said, would have to decide whether the differences between these proposals and those he had taken to the summit were sufficient to justify Britain going to war. So he's putting the weight back on the cabinet. I've done my bit. You decide whether you really want war. And there's another touch of emotion at this point. Chamberlain speaks to the cabinet about flying home to London that morning up the Thames and how he looked down at the rows of little terraced houses filling the banks of the river on either side, places like Deptford and the East End and so on. And he said he imagined a German bomber on that same course. And he asked himself what protection the government could give to the thousands of homes and families spread out beneath him. That's how he thought and felt about the crisis. Okay, it was now his own personal position was at stake, but he did genuinely, I think, feel that this was about the fate of London, and that's what mattered, not Prague or the Sudetenland.
Even so, the cabinet now turned against him.
Yes, so all the things he'd said didn't really have a decisive impact. During a long cabinet meeting, the Foreign Secretary, Lord Halifax, spoke up. Now, Halifax was a very loyal supporter of Chamberlain, but he'd had a sleepless night before that cabinet meeting after he'd been lobbied very strongly by his senior officials. And so Halifax now actually pulls the rug from underneath Chamberlain's feet. He says, Hitler has given us nothing. He is dictating terms just as though he'd won a war, but without having had to fight. And the Foreign Office concern here is about optics, really. Britain likes to think of itself as the greatest power in the world, but for the last 2 weeks, its leader's been racing off to Germany to court, if you like, a jumped-up former street thug. That doesn't look good. It really undermines credibility, and international power often turns on credibility. Frankly, now, Chamberlain is seeming increasingly incredible. So there's now talk of possible resignations. And so Chamberlain is in a very serious position. Like several prime ministers since, he finds that his presidential style, if it doesn't deliver positive results, provokes a big backlash. The cabinet is now reasserting its authority in a, frankly, belated attempt to reassert the authority of Great Britain.
Then the Czechs and the French, long-standing allies, also rejected the Godesberg terms, and Daladier said they were an attempt to destroy Czechoslovakia by force, enslaving her. Those are strong words.
Yeah, so Chamberlain realizes he's got to give ground, but he's determined not to lose control completely. So he tells the ministers that he's going to send his personal emissary, Horace Wilson, to Berlin with one final appeal. And Hitler's furious to hear that the Czechoslovak government has not caved in. And he does his usual act. He jumps up and down like a defiant boy, according to his interpreter, Paul Schmidt, later on, writing in his memoirs. So Wilson also gets up, and he rather reluctantly but very firmly gives the warning that British hardliners had been demanding. And you could say this is really the most important message in Anglo-German relations for 20 years, delivered not by a diplomat, but by Chamberlain's aide. The message is, if Germany invades Czechoslovakia, and if the French go to war on behalf of the Czechs, then Britain will feel obliged to fight alongside France.
Looking for a true crime podcast that goes beyond the headlines?
When I interviewed her 20 years on, she said that Fred told her there were hundreds of bodies buried in Gloucester.
It's a deeply disturbed love story.
Join Sky News crime correspondent Martin Brunt and journalist Helen Fospero on True Criminals, a weekly deep dive into the cases that shook the world, with insights so shocking they still haunt our imagination today. This is True Criminals.
When Gareth was 14, he was in a relationship with an attractive young teacher at his school, and he thought he was the luckiest boy in the world. But when she walked out of his life, everything started to unravel. 35 years later, everyone's acting like it never happened, and Gareth wants to understand why.
How about the truth? How about we do that first and then we work out where we're going to go from there? How about the truth?
This new 4-part series is about who gets to be a perpetrator and a victim. To listen, just search for Lucky Boy wherever you get your podcasts.
So in a sense, Hitler now has got what he always wanted, which is war.
Well, yes, he wanted a war against Czechoslovakia. The question is now whether he wants to do that, invade Czechoslovakia, if it will also provoke a war against Britain and France, which his generals have been rather wary about. So initially, it looks as if the plans for war go ahead. The date for the invasion of Czechoslovakia is set for October the 1st. Hitler ordered the units that would spearhead the invasion to start moving to their assembly areas. He also approved a full mobilization of the German armed forces to begin on Wednesday the 28th at 2 p.m. In London, there are also moves to counter this. Chamberlain agrees to the mobilization of the British fleet, and this is announced in the press the next morning, further ratcheting up the tension.
And this is when Chamberlain records his now notorious radio address. How horrible, fantastic, incredible it is that we should be digging trenches and trying on gas masks here because of a quarrel in a faraway country between people of whom we know nothing. It seems still more impossible that a quarrel which is already settled in principle should be the subject of war.
Yes, and he adds in that address, but I am going to work for peace to the last moment. And he makes one last desperate effort. He sends a telegram to Hitler the next morning, offering to come yet again to Germany. He said that he was convinced that you can get all the essentials without war and without delay. And at the same time, Chamberlain asks Mussolini, the Italian dictator, to urge Hitler to accept this proposal.
So Chamberlain's really out on a limb now.
Yeah.
But what happened next owes nothing to his message to Hitler, but really to Hitler's nerve.
Yes, it's fascinating. So we now know that Hitler spent most of that day watching a German division parade along the Wilhelmstrasse, passing the Chancellery building. And the event had been staged deliberately to impress foreign diplomats and newsmen with Germany's military might. But what struck them, and particularly Hitler, was the reaction of the Berlin population, the people themselves. Hardly anyone cheered. People turned their heads or they ducked into doorways. It seemed very clear that Germans had no stomach for another European conflict of the sort that they had just gone through 2 decades before. And what matters here is that Hitler had said again and again that success in war depends on the people's will as much as on the army's weaponry. So he's really angry at what he sees, but also what he's seeing is it hits him in the gut. It really takes him aback. And then the next morning, Wednesday the 28th, pressure on him mounts. The British position's now clear. Wilson's warning has been delivered. The news that the Royal Navy has mobilized, that's now in the German papers. And in another move which is well publicized, France calls up its army reservists.
So what were Hitler's circle advising him at this point?
Well, the mood is definitely against risking a European war at this stage. The only real hawks are Ribbentrop and Himmler. And Hitler also receives a message from Mussolini asking the Führer to delay his war plans and accept Chamberlain's proposal for a new summit. Mussolini offers himself in the role of a mediator. So this is now almost noon on the 28th. It's just 2 hours before the 2 p.m. trigger for general mobilization. And Hitler sits and he thinks hard, and then he says, "Tell the Duce that I accept his proposal."
Yeah, it's an amazing turnaround.
Yes. So here's Hitler, the man who believed you could do anything through willpower. He's wimped out. Yet it's ironic that in doing so, he probably saves his own life and extends the life of the Third Reich. Because what we now know is that behind the scenes, this apparently suicidal determination of Hitler's to risk a war with Britain and France has provoked increasing opposition within the German military. A plot's been hatched to take control of the city of Berlin, surround the Chancellery building, and overthrow the Führer. There's a raiding party ready to burst in and, if necessary, gun him down. And then suddenly you get this bombshell news. Hitler has pulled back from the brink. There's going to be another conference at Munich. So the plotters have no choice but to call off their plot. After the war, some of them blamed Hitler's survival on what Chamberlain did in 1938. But in reality, Britain is now reluctantly preparing for war. It's Hitler who blinks first, and he manages to save himself.
And obviously in London, nobody yet knows about Hitler's about-face. And that leads to an extraordinary drama that afternoon in the House of Commons.
Yes. So on September the 28th, millions of people had woken up in London fearing that this might be literally their last day. Chamberlain was due to speak to the House of Commons to explain his part in the Czech crisis and what was appearing now to be the countdown to European war. So you can imagine that the chamber was full of MPs. The atmosphere was breathless. The galleries were full of visitors and so on. Chamberlain rose just before 3 p.m. and he gives a clear and detailed account in his usual style of his meetings with Hitler, and Chamberlain's relentless chronology heightens the tension in a way. This happened, that happened, blah, blah, blah. But he must have been painfully aware that he lacks a punchline. What is he going to say at the end? He just got to the part about his final appeals that morning to Hitler and Mussolini, when there's a certain commotion at the other end of the chamber by the Speaker's chair, and a note is passed along the front bench to him. So you can imagine how people watching this thinking it's almost like a movie. And then Chamberlain takes the note, he puts on his pince-nez to read it, and then one observer says, his face, his whole body seemed to change. He looked 10 years younger, and his tone became triumphant. And he tells the House, "I have now been informed by Herr Hitler that he invites me to meet him at Munich tomorrow morning. I need not say what my answer will be." and the Commons just erupts. Wild cheering, people standing on their seats, waving their order papers and so on. And amid the hubbub, Chamberlain proposes that the debate be adjourned for a few days, after which he says, "Perhaps we may meet in happier circumstances."
Gosh, I wish I'd been there with the camera.
Well, you would have been waiting for a long time because the first TV broadcast of the House of Commons proceedings was not allowed until 1989. But it is interesting that on that day in 1938, September the 28th, there's what one MP called a strange metal honeycomb on the table in front of Chamberlain. And this was actually a microphone, a radio microphone installed because of plans that they might actually broadcast such a momentous speech to the whole nation. At the last minute, however, I think the political parties balked at setting such a precedent, and it was another 40 years before regular radio broadcasts from the Commons began in 1978.
So this was high drama at the time, but only heard by a few.
Yes, but the news spread very, very fast. And that drama, as you say, the high drama, was unbelievable. No fiction writer could have carried it off. Chamberlain himself called that moment the last desperate snatch at the last tuft, at the very verge of the precipice. The next morning, the atmosphere in London is almost like it was 2 weeks earlier when Chamberlain made his first flight to Germany. It was relief, euphoria, hope, and all the rest of it.
And before flying to Munich, Chamberlain speaks to the cameras again, mixing classic Shakespeare allusions and cliché proverbs. "When I come back, I hope I may be able to say, as Hotspur says in Henry IV, out of this nettle, danger, we pluck this flower, safety. When I was a little boy, I used to repeat, if at first you don't succeed, try again. That's what I'm doing."
Yes, and some critics rendered it, if at first you don't concede, fly again. But you have to say that at that moment, the critics were now few and they kept silent. Even Churchill. They were forced to wait impotently on events.
What was Churchill's position? Was he really ready to send an army to save Czechoslovakia?
No, he knew that Britain, essentially a sea power, had no way to fight a land war in the centre of Europe, even with French help. But he did believe that Chamberlain should have stood firm and called Hitler's bluff, instead of running after the Führer and making Britain look weak and silly. Like Chamberlain, he's ready to gamble, but he's basing his diplomacy on a fundamentally different assessment of the Führer and his pledges of peace. In other words, if we stick this out, it will be Hitler who backs down.
On to the final act, Act 3 of this drama. As a summit, Munich is very different from the one-on-one encounters at Berchtesgaden and Godesberg.
Yes, so Hitler and Chamberlain are joined at the Nazi headquarters in Munich by Daladier and Mussolini is relishing his role as a broker. The two Democrats are in dark suits, the dictator's in military uniform. There's no formal agenda, no proper record keeping. Mussolini takes the lead. He reads out his proposals as a basis for discussion, but in fact these have been prepared for him by the Germans. They're based on the discussions at Godesberg.
And Chamberlain once again is scurrying to catch up, still trying to recover from his early concessions. He pushes for a slower timetable and a slight reduction in the precise areas in question.
Yes, these are minor changes of form, not substance, to the deal that had been dictated at Godesberg. Even so, Hitler's irritated. He likens Chamberlain to a haggling shopkeeper. The delegations are then obliged to make rather uneasy small talk while they wait for Chamberlain's amendments to be written into the agreement. The document's finally ready for signature at 2 a.m. The 4 delegations troop into Hitler's room, where an enormous desk's topped off by a massive inkpot. Hitler dips his pen in to the inkpot only to discover there's no ink. Another inkpot has to be hastily produced. It's a pretty apt finale to a shambolic summit.
And the Czechs, whose country is actually being carved up, are not even present.
Yeah. The treatment is callous in the extreme. Their representatives were informed later of the terms by Chamberlain and Daladier. They were told that if they didn't accept, they would have to deal with Germany themselves. Chamberlain, again, was not really bothered about the Czechs in this larger scheme of things as he saw it. But he knew that he would have to take back to London more than just this Munich Agreement. And so while he was waiting for the draftsman to finish the final document, he asked Hitler for a further talk later that morning.
So another bit of Summitry on the hoof.
Yes, over breakfast at his hotel, Chamberlain hurriedly concocts a short statement for Hitler to sign. And this statement is pledging a new era in Anglo-German relations. He's got the help of William Strang, a token Foreign Office advisor. Strang is not at all happy about all this, but Chamberlain brushes aside his reservations.
And this time the two men meet at Hitler's private apartment in the Munich suburbs.
Yes, so now the Czechoslovakia question has apparently been resolved. Chamberlain wants to try and tackle Hitler on the broader problems facing Europe. The Spanish Civil War, for instance, the threat of aerial bombing. He tries to talk about those kind of issues, and then he says, it would be a pity if the Munich Agreement passed off with nothing more than the settlement of the Czech question. And he says then, I've drafted this short statement about our mutual desire to improve Anglo-German relations and thereby enhance European stability. And he pulls the document out of his jacket pocket. He asks Hitler to sign. Now, this is what became the notorious piece of paper. Chamberlain intends that to be a signal that the two leaders were ready to move towards a Europe-wide settlement. This would be the climax of his Summitry.
What was Hitler's reaction?
Well, interpreter Schmidt said that the Führer was, quote, pale and moody throughout the meeting. He didn't say very much. And Schmidt actually put this down to Chamberlain's really rapturous reception in Munich. Wherever the Prime Minister went, he was cheered through the streets. His hotel had been deluged with flowers. That was not good as far as Hitler was concerned. Hitler never liked to share the limelight. But I think actually one might guess that morning Hitler, was coming to terms with what had happened. He was furious at having been cheated out of the glory of a splendid little war. Even more galling, he knew he had cheated himself by losing his nerve at the last minute. Yet he signed. I think that signature meant nothing to Hitler. But even now, Chamberlain clung to his faith in, if you like, gentlemanly honour. Back at his hotel, he patted his pocket with satisfaction and told Strang, I've got it. And arriving at Heston Airport later that day, Chamberlain famously declares, this morning I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper that bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German Naval Agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another ever again.
And Chamberlain was greeted now with a returning hero's welcome.
Yes, even in his wildest dreams as a peacemaker, nothing could have prepared Chamberlain for his reception back in London. It was pouring with rain, but the crowds were vast. At the request of the king, he drove to Buckingham Palace, and in really what was an unprecedented gesture, he acknowledged cheering Londoners from the front balcony together with the royal family. And finally, with great difficulty driving through the crowds, the car took him back to Downing Street.
What was his mood now? All that adulation must have gone to his head, surely.
Well, it's clear Chamberlain was exhausted from the succession of late nights, 2 weeks of intense drama. He admitted later he'd been close to a nervous breakdown that weekend. But he was also, I think, really exultant that, as he'd hoped, he'd plucked the flower from the nettle. And in the packed entrance hall of 10 Downing Street, one of his entourage urged Chamberlain to repeat Disraeli's famous words on returning from the Congress of Berlin in 1878, the claim that Disraeli had come back having secured peace with honour. And Chamberlain turned round and shot back very icily, "No, I do not do that sort of thing." But when he went upstairs to acknowledge the crowds, he was conscious that he was at the same window from which Disraeli had spoken 60 years before. And in that moment, Chamberlain made one last error of judgment. He let his emotions get the better of his reason. "My good friends, this is the second time in our history there has come back from Germany to Downing Street peace with honour. I believe it is peace for our time." Those words haunted him for the rest of his life, and they continue to haunt his memory today.
So as agreed, Hitler marched into the Sudetenland in October 1938, and despite the general relief that this had not provoked a European-wide war, there was still dissent. Churchill denounced the Munich settlement as a total and unmitigated defeat, saying, "The belief that security can be obtained by throwing a small state to the wolves is a fatal delusion." And that really did prove, didn't it, to be a prophetic warning?
Yes. In March 1939, just a few months later, Hitler went on to seize the rest of Czechoslovakia. And so this clearly took him beyond his professed aim of just bringing Germans within the Reich. And worse still for Chamberlain, the Führer had torn up that personal Munich Agreement which the Prime Minister had placed such faith in. So Chamberlain was being proved just a few months later than Munich to have been totally wrong in what he told the cabinet and the country.
So this was the end of appeasement, clearly. But Hitler drew the wrong conclusions from Chamberlain's Summitry.
Yes. After Munich, Hitler now believed he got the measure of his opponents, and he told his generals, "Our enemies are small worms. I saw them in Munich." He was confident that Britain and France would not fight for Poland when he invaded it in September 1939. But this time he was mistaken.
Yeah, the worms turned. Chamberlain delivered his ultimatum to Berlin and gave his famous radio address. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us.
Yes, finally the worms had turned. And Hitler would pay the price of a world war that eventually brought about his destruction. And it's interesting, it's almost amazing, I think, that in 1945, as the Allies finally closed in on Berlin and Hitler had to face up to his inevitable defeat, in those final ravings, he blamed being enticed into Summitry by Chamberlain for what had gone wrong. Hitler convinced himself that he should have gone to war in September 38. He fumed that he'd been taken for a ride by that arch-capitalist bourgeois Chamberlain who flew to the Berghof with his deceptive umbrella in his hand. He talked of peace, said Hitler, but he really intended to wage ruthless war against us when he was ready. And Hitler railed that Chamberlain's one and only object in undertaking the trip was to gain time.
The year's grace did allow Britain to develop radar and deploy its new Hurricanes and Spitfires, which were crucial eventually in the Battle of Britain. Some revisionist historians have said that really this was Chamberlain's plan underneath all of these negotiations to gain time for Britain to rearm. What do you think of that?
Well, it's true. I think that the time gained was very important. That clearly was the case. But I would say that gaining extra time was simply a byproduct of the talks. Chamberlain's real aim was to avert a devastating war. And his approach to the summit and to the whole business of Summitry was based on false premises and poor intelligence. Remember, Germany is simply not capable of delivering a knockout blow on London in 1938. Chamberlain could have stood firm and called Hitler's bluff. And had he done so, the Führer's house of cards might have collapsed. As we've said, there's active plotting within the German military to topple Hitler. Now, we don't know what would have happened, but Chamberlain was essentially not willing to call Hitler's bluff in the way Churchill had argued.
So this is the paradox of a careful politician who made a huge gamble. He staked his reputation on the belief that he could and should do a deal with Adolf Hitler.
Yes, and that tragic mistake, I think, was what preoccupied him in the last year of his life. So he is, by then, in 1940, ravaged by cancer, really humiliating, painful cancer of the bowel. He dies in November 1940, and he must have known and could see that his once towering reputation lay in ruins. He'd started out afraid that Hitler was a madman. He'd convinced himself that the German dictator was a man of business whose word could be trusted. So that's a grotesque self-deception. And then there's this hubris of believing he could almost single-handedly bring peace to Europe. This was a prime minister who acted like a president and paid the price. Summitry had made him and broken him.
Yet for all his misjudgments, Chamberlain was a pioneer. His Summitry blazed a trail that others, including his great critic, Winston Churchill, would now follow. Join us next time as we explore another pivotal moment in the history of Summitry, how at the end of World War II, Roosevelt, Churchill and Stalin clashed and colluded to hammer out the future of Europe at summits in Tehran and Yalta. You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating History. Please rate, review and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. It really helps us get the word out and extend our reach. You can follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram and send us your comments and questions there or by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Also, do check out our first series, Creating Churchill, available wherever you get your podcasts. If you'd like to buy us or the team a coffee at ko-fi.com, we'd be very grateful. Details of how to donate are in the podcast description. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating History is a Clear Story production.